Safety instructions. Always wear eye protection when operating or performing maintenance on this tool. Always wear hearing protection when operating this tool. Tools needed. The following tools will be needed to service the air screwdriver. Hammer, 3mm pin punch, small block of wood, scribe, 17mm combination wrench, 19mm combination wrench, 38mm combination wrench, internal snap ring pliers, 2mm hex wrench, number 1 Phillips screwdriver, needle nose pliers, torque wrench with 80 to 100 feet-pounds capacity, 19mm socket, pipe thread sealing compound, multi-purpose grease, vise with 5-inch jaw capacity, arbor press 2-ton and self-made head for press. Disassembly of the clutch housing. First, clamp the air screwdriver in the vise with the handle end facing up. Use your hand on the handle of the housing to loosen the clutch housing by turning the housing in a clockwise direction. Remove the air screwdriver from the vise. Now remove the clutch housing and the clutch assembly from the housing assembly. Hold the clutch assembly in your hand and use the scribe to remove the retaining ring from the clutch assembly. Remove the washer, spring, ball retainer, and the steel ball from the clutch assembly. Then use the scribe to remove the retaining ring from the clutch assembly. Now remove the spacer from the clutch assembly. Clamp the 1/4-inch hex wrench in the vise with the long end facing up. Now place the clutch assembly upside down on the 1/4-inch hex wrench. And use the 17mm combination wrench to loosen the adjust nut. Note, you should be careful to not loosen the 4 steel balls when loosening the adjust nut. Remove the 1/4-inch hex wrench and the clutch assembly from the vise. Then use your hand to remove the adjust nut. Washer. Spring. washer and 4 steel balls from the cam spindle. Use the internal snap ring pliers to remove the retaining ring from the clutch carrier. Now the clutch carrier can be removed from the opposite side of the cam spindle. Use the scribe to remove the retaining ring from the housing assembly. Use your hand to remove drive dog from the housing assembly. Then clamp the housing in the vise with the reduction gear assembly facing up. Use the 38mm combination wrench to loosen the clamp nut from the housing. Remove the housing assembly from the vise and use your hand to remove the clamp nut from the housing. Now remove the first internal gear from the motor assembly. Remove the work spindle from the motor assembly. Now use your hand to remove the first set of 3 planet gears from the motor assembly. Remove reduction spindle from the motor assembly. Now, remove the other internal gear from the motor assembly. Then remove the remaining 3 planet gears. Remove the pinion gear from the motor assembly. Now tap the work spindle lightly on the workbench to remove the spring guide from the work spindle. And finally use the scribe to remove the spring from the work spindle. Disassembly of motor housing. First, use your hand to remove the rotor assembly and pin from the housing. Then clamp the cylinder in the vise and use the hammer and 3mm pin punch to drive the rotor assembly out of the front end plate. Now remove the cylinder and front end plate from the vise. And finally, remove the 5 rotor blades from the rotor. Disassembly of the trigger. First, use the 2mm hex wrench to loosen the set screw and then remove the trigger from the housing. Then use your hand to remove the valve spring from the housing. Now place the housing onto the small block of wood and use the 3mm pin punch and hammer to drive the pin out of the housing. And finally, use the needle nose pliers to remove the reverse lever from the housing. Note, do not attempt to remove the valve stem from the housing. Removal of the valve stem will cause damage to the air screwdriver. Disassembly of the air inlet. First, clamp the housing in the vise with the air inlet facing up. Then use the 19mm combination wrench to remove the air inlet from the housing. Use the number 1 Phillips screwdriver to remove 2 screws that hold the exhaust muffler onto the housing. Now remove the exhaust muffler from the housing. And finally, remove the housing from the vise. Assembly of the air inlet. First, clamp the housing in the vise with the air inlet facing up. Now place the exhaust muffler onto the end of the housing. Then insert and tighten the 2 screws into the housing using the number 1 Phillips screwdriver. Apply a small amount of pipe thread sealing compound to the threads of the air inlet. Use your hand to thread the air inlet into the housing. Now use the torque wrench and the 19mm socket to tighten the air inlet to 30 feet-pounds. Finally, remove the housing from the vise. Assembly of the trigger. First, insert the reverse lever into the housing. Make sure the valve stem is in the center of the reverse lever. Then center the 2 tabs of the reverse lever and then press firmly into the housing. Place the housing onto the small block of wood and use the hammer and the 3mm pin punch to drive the pin into the housing. place the valve spring into the reverse lever. Now, connect an air hose to the air inlet. The air pressure will force the valve stem to the outermost position. Carefully place the trigger over the end of the valve stem. Now position the reverse lever to the left or right side to allow access to the set screw and tighten the set screw using the 2mm hex wrench. And finally, disconnect the air hose from the air inlet. Assembly of the motor housing. First, insert the 5 rotor blades into the rotor with the rounded edges inserted first. Now place the cylinder and the front end plate onto the rotor assembly. Use the arbor press with self-made head to press the front end plate onto the rotor assembly. Align the end plate, cylinder, and front end plate holes and insert the pin through the 3 parts. And finally, carefully align the pin to the top center position of the housing and slide the rotor assembly into the housing. Assembly of the clutch housing. First, clamp the housing assembly in the vise with the rotor assembly facing up. Now insert the pinion gear into the end of the rotor. Place the 3 planet gears onto the reduction spindle. Put the reduction spindle assembly onto the motor assembly. Now place the internal gear onto the housing assembly. Place 3 planet gears onto the work spindle. Place the planet gear assembly onto the end of the reduction spindle. Now install the other internal gear onto the housing assembly. Apply a small amount of pipe thread sealing compound onto the threads of the clamp nut. Screw the clamp nut onto the housing assembly. And then use the 38mm combination wrench to tighten the clamp nut. Remove the housing assembly from the vise. Then, put the drive dog onto the end of the work spindle with flat face down. Now use the scribe to press the retaining ring into position. Insert the spring guide into the small end of the spring. Then slide the spring guide and spring into the end of the work spindle with the large end of the spring first. Slide the clutch carrier onto the cam spindle. Turn over the cam spindle and use the internal snap ring pliers to insert the retaining ring into the clutch carrier, making sure you hear an audible click when the retaining ring is fully seated. Rotate the clutch carrier until the 4 slots are aligned with the 4 slots in the cam spindle. Now put the 4 steel balls into the slots in the clutch carrier and cam spindle. Insert the washer onto the cam spindle with the grooved side of the washer toward the steel balls. Hold this assembly in your hand to avoid losing the steel balls. Now slide the spring onto the cam spindle. Slide the washer onto the assembly with the key aligned with the slot in the cam spindle. The teeth of the washer should face up. Use your hand to screw the adjust nut onto the cam spindle a few threads. Then clamp the 1/4-inch hex wrench into the vise with the long side facing up. Place the cam spindle onto the 1/4-inch hex wrench. Use the 17mm combination wrench to tighten the adjust nut until you can see the first threads of the cam spindle are even with the outside face of the adjust nut. Remove the cam spindle assembly and 1/4-inch hex wrench from the vise. Place the spacer onto the cam spindle assembly with the key in the slot. Slide the retaining ring onto the cam assembly and make sure it is fully seated in the lower groove. Then insert the steel ball into the side of the cam spindle. Slide the ball retainer onto the end of the cam spindle with small diameter end first. Insert the spring into the ball retainer. Now insert the washer into the ball retainer with the grooved face up and hold it in position. Clamp the cam spindle assembly in a vise. Then use the small needle nose pliers to press the washer down while you insert the retaining ring and press it into its groove. Remove the cam spindle assembly from the vise. Apply a small amount of pipe thread sealing compound to the threads of the clutch housing. Place the cam spindle assembly onto the housing assembly. Thread the clutch housing onto the housing assembly by turning in a counterclockwise direction. Reposition the housing assembly in the vise so that the vise is holding the clutch housing. Now tighten the clutch housing by turning the housing in a counterclockwise direction, and finally remove the air screwdriver from the vise.